Hi, folks. Dr. Dave Ballard here. I am talking to you today about Chapter 8, which is organizational learning. You don't think of an organization like a person that, studies for their DMV test, but organizations do learn. They should learn if they're going to face changing environments, be those political or social or economic or demographic. And all of our agencies are impacted by those kinds of change. So understanding how you do this, how you face up, how you learn to do this, you'll find that organizations are a lot like a pupil in a classroom. So let's take a look at this group of articles with that in mind, that we're here to talk and discuss how organizations learn. And those are different for different types of organizations, of course. So we'll start with your handy-dandy PowerPoint. Not my favorite way of lecturing, but on these videos, I can't think of a way that makes them organized and something you can look at. So, all right, organizational learning and change based upon that learning. Okay. Organizational learning. It is difficult to achieve and sustain learning over time. So theories of organizational learning and change tend to focus on attention on obstacles that impede learning and change. So how can we get past those? There are cultural modes of organizational change. So Edgar Schein talks about how the culture of the organization impacts how it can learn, the assumptions that are taken for granted and kind of invisible, and how interests are served by those assumptions. And so people resist change. Humans don't like change, whether it's in interpersonal relationships, friendships, or where they work. We find that humans resist change. Jester Sorensen talked about how strong cultures create the framework for action. It allows that, it encourages that, but that also inhibits change. So it's kind of like a two-edged sword. These strong cultures really help organizational performance in stable environments that need incremental change, so more bureaucratic. Strong cultures really are problematic, according to Sorensen, for performance that's in environments that are more volatile or a lot more change. So he's really kind of arguing for a bureaucracy. So do strong cultures necessarily inhibit change? So strong organizational cultures can be obstacles for change if the values of protecting it through domination. So in typical hierarchical organizations, we have a problem with this. An organization can have a strong culture that values the open exchange of ideas. That's Mary Fowlett's model. And this might encourage, support, facilitate organizational learning and change. It's not necessarily the strength of the culture, but the extent to which the culture supports or inhibits change and learning. Okay? The population ecology model of organizational change, it's predicated on the idea that organizations do not like to change. It occurs instead through an evolution, a process of survival of the fittest, if you will. Well-adapted organizations will survive. Less adaptive will fail. This is kind of a typical American business model. It's, if you don't offer a good product and your business goes out of business, that's too bad. Think about this in terms of public institutions. Right now, libraries are really being challenged by the really wholesale change in how we accumulate and bring in knowledge to our lives. So books are increasingly not as important to people, whereas somebody that knows how to use the internet, somebody who can be a really good help for a research paper, for example, that person's really valuable. Think about what that means to the institution. We no longer need lots of shelves to stack books. We can get them electronically. We have to pay a lot more for computer services, but we also have to have people that are trained not in the Dewey Decimal System, which is how we used to organize books, but rather how we do it these days electronically. Change over time at the population level, organizations can identify a niche in which they're well adapted and succeed at it. So college libraries are really focusing in on things like research evaluation, information literacy, and those were not missions many years ago. It's an interesting thing. I wrote a paper with one of the local librarians about people who have different access to the technology. So our poor students have less chance to have, technology at their home or at their disposal. And it seems weird these days when you look around and see everybody with an Apple, but 10 years ago, that really wasn't true. And 10 years ago, there was a divide. The poorer you were, and that meant, you were disproportionately Latino, Latina, or African American. Those students had a real challenge compared to other students that had better opportunities, better financial resources. Now we see a lot more kind of less differentiation there and more kind of everybody has them. But if you look around, you'll still see students in class that don't have a computer, that don't have a smartphone. As a professor, that number has really shrank over the years because most people have decided that having that access to information in their hand, so they can watch cat videos, is more important than it used to be. And maybe they're right. A contingency model, organizations succeed to the extent that their structures match the requirements of the environment. Leaders are important in this, and organization is a process of differentiating and reintegrating the organization in response to diverse environmental demands. You need to kind of redo yourself every once in a while. It's kind of like getting a makeover for the organization, and contingencies model is one way to do that. Make sure you read about the leaders. Resource dependency model of organizational change. It's a rationalist theory of organizational change. They succeed to the extent that they adjust their activities and external relationships to the access, the resources they need to survive. Now, for nonprofits, for example, this is a really important kind of way of looking at what you have and making sure you can stay on your mission. Think of, let's say an animal rescue organization. You may not get lots of grants or government support, so you need kind of somebody to help you out or a group of people. And so making sure you keep those people happy, making sure you maintain those external relationships may be your lifeblood. If you don't, you may lose the game of running a nonprofit. Post-structuralist models of organizational change. It occurs when opportunities are created to have conversations that identify and question organizational assumptions. So here, it's kind of like self-analysis for the organization. It does not occur simply by changing structures. You can change structures, but people stay very similar if you don't change the culture of the organization. Organizational structures should not be designed only in response to the external environments. You have to remember the internal. And creating a discursive space, a fancy way of saying where people can talk. It enables your employees to identify and question the assumptions, and it fosters advocacy for new ways of working. That's a really interesting idea about creating, and it's a little different than some of the others. Now, changing the bureaucratic organizational form, it's noted for its stability. That's one of its real strengths. And it doesn't have those horizontal ties. So, you know, it does have some problems responding to change, to innovation, to adaptation. But bureaucracy is good at codifying rules, meaning making them real and sustaining routines that have been learned. So if you do make change, bringing them into a formalized structure like a bureaucracy may breed better success chances. The relational organizational form, ideas can readily be combined and shared across specialties. Initiative or change can be taken at multiple levels of an organization. And you create this idea of organic solidarity, namely that people will come together to fight the good fight for the good of the organization because they're working in lots of different ways. The leadership is important in this. So some of these names are a little tougher. Arduous, single loops and double loop models and research on decision making. All right, this is a very difficult reading. I understand that. Single loop learning that does not question the design, goals, or activities of the organization. And organizations have a tendency to encourage single loop. Double loop, feedback loops, ask about changing fundamental aspects of the organization. And you can see why an organization may not want to question its core values. So it's a rather interesting way of approaching it. So using double loops gives you a better chance, but single loops are what are encouraged in organizations. And I admit this is a hard read, so when you get to it, there are some inhibitors of learning. Now, this is the real value of this article, okay? Conflict, avoidance, political exchange, misinterpretation, miscommunication, people who are gaming the system, bargaining, you know, kind of between one person and another. I'll do this, you do that. This is really hard. Okay, makes it difficult. They're really adaptation mechanisms for humans, and people come up with lots of ways to get around change. The single loop learning is reinforced by the desire for organization control. Leaders, if they're going to be leaders, they need to create an environment conducive to double loop learning. So this really advocates for the second variety, not the first. And it gives leaders way to identify when problems arise and then a mechanism to fix that. So the double loop is the mechanism to fix that. I think that's good enough. DiMaggio and Powell, the Iron Cage Revisited. Now the Iron Cage refers to it refers to a very classic study that talked about the iron cage of rationality, which is bureaucracy. And here they say it's revisited. So they're going back to it 100 years later. The institutional isomorphism and collective rationality in organization. Institutional theory of change. How do you change? Okay? Organizations can and do change. Some are early adapters, to use that marketing term. You know, they want to be on the cutting edge, so they change really early in a trend. Sometimes to their disadvantage, but many times, if they're the first out of the gate, so to speak, they have a better chance of survival. Late adapters, on the other hand, imitate what people do. They, to use the terminology, they get best practices from somebody else and incorporate those. It's really, according to these two, not the organization's inability to change, but the desire to optimize legitimacy rather than performance. That's an interesting argument, but one I kind of look at. Levett and March, organizational learning. Organizational learning is shaped by the limits of human cognition, or what they call bounded rationality. Okay? Behavior is oriented towards using previously successful routines. Think of that. That's a really interesting point. We look backwards to face a future. So we go back to what worked before to face very different circumstances perhaps in the future. Sometimes that works because what we were doing before was working. Sometimes it's completely out of date and it won't work. So problems in learning from experiences come from inadequacies of cognition, the features of organizations, the structures, so basically culture, okay? Organizational strategies to promote learning, but these don't always generate behavioral change. People don't like to change. I mean, they really don't. How are we going to face a future in public administration if we don't address technology, for example? Well, I don't like technology. Oh, my old job, the old way we did it was better. You may not have a choice. So we'll talk about technology in chapter 9, by the way. Edmondson, the local and variegated nature of learning and organization, a group level perspective. Okay, you should recognize this argument. Learning is an interpersonal, relational process. It's about psychological safety. The perception that it is safe to express disagreement. How many do you feel that you're actually safe to tell the boss, no, I disagree, we're doing it the wrong way? Now, you got to do that in the correct organizational culture way, but can you say those things? And it is a necessary condition for learning and change. The book even uses the word radical learning. But each organization does it differently. It's differential. Fletcher, Balin, and Blake Beard. Sounds like a law firm, doesn't it? Practical pushing, creative discourse, creating discursive space in organizational narratives. So you need to create ways of people having these conversations. The way people can identify problems, question the assumptions. I mean, you create these by allowing discussion. And these alternative spaces where people can do that can be very important to organizational change. They can also be dysfunctional, let's be honest. You know, you can get a bunch of people that just complain and don't ever really do anything except complain. These spaces promote new ways of working. New structures might be implemented. Structures are then informed and supported by new assumptions. The whole idea is we can create this structurally. Kellogg, operating room, relation spaces, and micro-institutional change in surgery. When you think of surgery, you don't necessarily think of bureaucracies. So maybe Fowlet's relational space can help us understand how the work is done. Now, the TV stereotype is the doctors are God and everybody else serves them. But the fact is that an operating room is much more of a give and take, a relational take. So a doctor has a special charge nurse and has an anesthesiologist and other people that they like to work with because they have these interpersonal relationships. Power still plays a role in the assumptions, and a nurse telling a doctor, hey, you're being dumb, you're not doing the right thing, you shouldn't have cut over there, might not work. There's some structural problems like the way we organize surgery, long hours, right? That leads to errors. Regulation to limit hours means that people don't necessarily get the care they need. It does talk about an Iron Man culture. Now there it's not being gender specific. It's talking about how you just push through. And if you've ever been in a hospital and seen how people work, there are some people that are walking around and they have been awake and working for 36 hours. They're not at their best. And that's not good for when we train doctors, but it's also not good for patients who come in and need the brightest minds. And when they're dulled by fatigue, those minds might make mistakes. So we have coalitions talked about, create efficacy to challenge dominant culture. So if a doctor's too tired, the nurse might say, okay, we need a break here, or you can have these coalitions that are self-reinforcing, and you don't want to let your work group down. All right, that's a pretty easy chapter. Not really. These are really difficult to read, and I understand that. But by now, you should have those understanding them, and you should be getting used to this kind of academic language. But think about your organization. Think about if you're a manager and you go, I need to change. These advice pieces are there. Now, you might not be working in a ER or an operating room or the Army or any of the other articles and their workplace practical applications. But can you adapt their ideas to your environment in social services, in mental health services, or whatever you might be doing? That's the key to good theory, is it can translate from one area to another. Let me shut off.